Have you ever wondered why, no matter how many new social situations you go to, no matter how many times you challenge yourself, no matter how many times you go out and try to meet people, your social anxiety doesn't get better? Despite people telling you, hey, if you want to get better at socializing, you got to socialize more. If you want to get over your fear of socializing, you have to expose yourself. You have to do exposure therapy. You have to get out there and test yourself and test your limits. And you've tried this and you've done this and you go out and you try to talk to people, and no matter what you do, it seems like nothing works. Well, that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about why it's not working. And there are two main reasons why it is not working. But before I get into all that, I just want to make a quick shout out to a lot of new subscribers we've had over the last week or two, which has been really cool to see. I want to welcome everybody who's joining the podcast and thank some people who've been sharing the podcast and getting the word out. I want to help as many people as I can out with social anxiety. And I've actually, if you've noticed, I've changed the name of the podcast. And this is really just to keep everything else that I'm doing in alignment. And I really want to narrow down and focus on social anxiety. So that's why I've changed the name. Otherwise, it's the same podcast. It's me. I'm going to be talking about mental health, but in this case, really just social anxiety. Okay, so let's talk about why doesn't exposure therapy work, or why doesn't going out and testing these things out and doing new things and talking to people, why does it make me feel better? Why do I still feel anxious? I think there are two main reasons why this happens. The first reason is because, one, you may not be doing it correctly. The problem with the way that exposure therapy is explained to people, and oftentimes the way that it is practiced by clinicians, is not really the correct way it's supposed to go. And part of this is not really a lot of clinicians' fault. There has been a recent shift, a recent change in some of the research about what works and what doesn't work in exposure therapy. Research for this stuff is kind of hard because it's hard to pinpoint, okay, we have this therapy that seems to be working pretty well, not perfectly, but we have to figure out what elements of it work and what elements of it don't. How do we weed out what works? So when we think of exposure therapy, I think most people think of just going out and doing things that are hard, maybe ramping things up, exposing yourself to fears. And sometimes it can get really wacky with social anxiety, right? You might hear people say, you should go out and do snow angels on the grocery store. You should do all these sorts of wacky things to get all these eyes on you and do embarrassing things and get used to that embarrassing fear. And there's some value to that. There's no doubt that there's value to that, though there's no point in doing it, especially initially, if you're not ready to do that. But the bigger issue with that is it used to be the case that the mental health field believed, that what was making the person overcome the fear was them getting used to or sitting with or riding out the anxiety. And the fancy term for this is habituation. And basically what this means is, hey, go to a social event, feel really anxious, and eventually you'll feel the anxiety, but it'll get to a point where it'll get so high that it'll eventually just fade out and it'll reduce. And this is what we thought for a long time, that you could just habituate is the word. You can habituate to the anxiety. You can get used to the anxiety. So you just go to an event and just stand there and eventually you'll just get comfortable. Now, habituation does work for some things, but it really doesn't work for social anxiety. And the reason it doesn't work is because of what we talked about in the last episode. And if you didn't listen to the last episode, I really recommend you go back and listen to the last episode. The last episode, I talked about safety behaviors in social anxiety. And safety behaviors are things that we do to keep ourselves safe when we are in a social situation. And sometimes we don't even realize we're doing them. They can be unconscious. They could be folding our arms and crossing our body to have like tight body language. It could be sitting in the back of a room. It could be not telling a joke because you're worried that someone's going to judge you. It could be whatever it is that you do in a social situation to prevent yourself from feeling more anxiety, basically to keep yourself safe. Okay. So the problem is, if you go to a social situation and you try to do this habituation stuff, which is just, hey, sit there and let's wait for the anxiety to ride out, but you're not actually doing anything about the safety behaviors, well, it's not going to get better because you're not doing anything different. And this is why a lot of people get stuck in this phase of exposure therapy. They go and try to do the exposure, and maybe they'll do something. Maybe the therapist will tell them, hey, I want you to go to the grocery store and I want you to say hello to somebody. It's something maybe very simple. And maybe you're able to do that, but what you don't realize is all the little safety behaviors that you're doing in order to finagle your way around it. Maybe you talk in a really low voice because you don't want to project your voice, or you go on a line where there's no people on that line, so other people can't hear you, so only the one person can hear you, right? So you're not really challenging yourself in the way. And what that does is it reinforces the fear. You don't actually learn anything new. And what they're finding with the new research, what is more effective for social anxiety is what is called inhibitory learning, which is basically learning to discredit old beliefs. So if you have fears about what might come, what might happen, we need to in a sense, prove those fears wrong. And the problem is, in a lot of therapy, they will try to do this mentally. They will try to do this with cognitive attempts. They will try to ask you to rationally disprove your thoughts, right? You probably have experienced this if you've been to therapy before, where the therapist will say, well, what's the likelihood of that happen? How frequently does that actually happen? How bad could it be? These sorts of questions. And again, there is utility in that. But the problem is, if you don't have an experience that confirms that disconfirmation, right, that change in thought, if you don't have an experience that puts a stamp on that, you're not going to believe it. It just feels like bullshit. It just feels like you're blowing smoke out of your ass to make yourself feel better. So you actually need the experience. But the only way to have a new experience is to do something new. So the first reason why your exposure therapy is not working is because you are still stuck in these safety behaviors. And these safety behaviors can get very specific. I did a very general rundown of what safety behaviors look like last time, but they can get really, really specific. So let's say, everybody has a different fear socially. Some people are afraid that they're going to be annoying. They're going to talk too much. They're going to be really loud. So they might not talk at all. Their safety behavior, well, I'm going to shut up. I'm just not going to say anything. Other people, they might be afraid that they're going to be too boring. So what they do is they just ramble on and on. They're still really anxious, but they just ramble, but they know that they're not actually talking about things that they want to be talking about. They don't feel confident in what they're saying. They're just saying words because they just want to say something, right? So it really depends. It's very context dependent on what is driving your social anxiety, because everybody has a different thing that drives it. But the main point is, are you still doing things to keep you safe? And what we really need to do, and what a clinician should be really doing with you, is figuring out for you specifically, what do you tend to do to keep yourself safe? And it might be subtle. It might be unconscious. It might be this really small thing that maybe you don't even notice that you're doing, but you do it every single time. If you're still doing those things, then you're still in that safety place. Okay, we need to stretch yourself out, get out of it. That is what the real exposure therapy is. So exposure therapy does work. It just has to be done correctly. And a lot of times exposure therapy is not done correctly because they just give you prompts like, hey, go out and talk to somebody. It's like, okay, maybe I can go out and talk to somebody, but I did 17 things to prepare myself for talking to that person. And here's another safety behavior. I replayed the conversation, or I created the conversation in my head before I went and talked to them. I thought about all the ways this conversation go. That's a safety behavior because you're preparing yourself. You're trying to get yourself ready for an uncomfortable conversation because you want to be safe. So that's safety behavior. So that has to be addressed. Okay. So again, it's very context dependent, but that is the first reason why the exposure therapy is not working. The second reason exposure therapy is not working for you is because you are not addressing what we call your post-event processing, which is really just a fancy word for saying your rumination. How do you think about the event after the fact, right? Because this is a huge problem in social anxiety. One of the tenets of social anxiety is that after you have a social situation, regardless of how it goes, and we'll get into that because we often just assume it went bad, but we actually don't know how it went because we are so biased and negative, we can't actually make that judgment. But we have an event, we think it went bad, then we go home and we replay the situation, And we tell ourselves how terrible we were, how embarrassing, how stupid. How could I have said that? Oh my God, I'm so awkward. I'm so cringy. What's wrong with me? If you're doing that after your exposure, of course you're not going to feel any better. And what's that going to do? It's going to precipitate for the next social event you have. All those thoughts are going to start. The last time I said that really stupid thing, I'm gonna really embarrass myself today. So you're constantly in this state of fear and thinking and thinking and thinking. Okay, so that has to be addressed. If you're not changing how you talk to yourself, you're still going to feel the same exact way. Okay, and there are different causes for this. For different reasons why we do this. Some people obviously they can point to maybe mistreatment in their early years, maybe by parents, maybe by peers, maybe by bullies. They have this idea that they're unlikable, right? I've been mistreated my whole life, so it must be something wrong with me. Sometimes it's not so easy to point out. Some people, they don't have social anxiety at all, and then in their mid-20s, all of a sudden they develop it. There's no like breakthrough thing that they can say, oh, this is what caused it, right? So social anxiety has all different sorts of forms. I mean, it tends to form in adolescence, but not necessarily. So it really depends on you. The reason why I'm saying that is because what's important here is our narrative, the way we talk about ourselves. That is the way that we show up in the world, and that is the way we feel and think about ourselves. And so if we have all these negative thoughts, well, obviously we're not going to feel so good about ourselves. So we have to address that. We have to address what we believe about ourselves. Now, look, if you're someone who has had a really tough time throughout your life and you've always had this negativity, there's probably some deeper roots there that we need to address. Why do you feel this way? Why do you think you're such a loser? Why do you think you're so awkward? And that definitely needs to be addressed. Although I do want to say we still have to be careful about the rumination. Sometimes, especially for social anxiety, too much self-awareness is not a good thing. As we know, as I talked about in past podcasts, self-consciousness, which by definition is overly conscious about yourself. You're too aware of yourself, too much thinking about yourself, too much replaying, too much evaluating, too much analyzing is not a good thing. A mentally healthy person, generally speaking, they're not thinking about themselves a whole lot. Okay. Generally, if you're in a good mental place, you're not thinking all that much at all. You're thinking about what you want to do. You're thinking about your future, but you're not really thinking about your past. So we don't really want to fixate too much about the past. And I want to point out here that what the research shows, and this is hard for people to like believe, but people with social anxiety, they have a negativity bias. And the problem is that when you have social anxiety, you don't think you're biased. You think you're being objective. You think, no, I really am a loser. You think, no, look at all these weird things that happened to me over my life. I'm so awkward. I'm so cringy. Nobody likes me. When the reality is, you have a bias towards yourself. You go into social situations and you're analyzing yourself and you're thinking about every little thing that you did wrong. You go into a public speaking event and you're nitpicking over every little word that comes out of your mouth. You're wondering how you're standing, how you're walking, all these little intricacies. You're so, I don't want to say self-obsessed, but you're so concerned about yourself. You can't turn your brain off. It's all you do is think about yourself. And what that does, rumination by definition, what it actually does, it makes our emotions more intense. This is what the research shows. The more you think about a negative thing, the more negative you feel about it. The more you think about a past negative event, the more negative that event comes. Now, there are ways to process trauma and things like that, but generally speaking, if you're simply ruminating about an event that just happened, the more you think about it, the worse it's going to get because you're hyper self-conscious, right? When you're in a social situation, just think about in a present social situation, the more you think about how you're talking, the more judgmental you're going to be about how you're talking. The perfect sweet spot is you want to have some level of self-awareness, but you also just want to be able to spitfire. You want to be able to just talk and not have to worry about it, not have to think so much about it. All this to say that the problem here is the rumination. The rumination is the problem in and of itself. But a lot of times when we are doing the post-processing afterwards. We think that the problem is us. We think I need to think about this stuff. This stuff is really important. It's really important that I figure out what is wrong with me, because it's the only way I'm going to feel normal. And we think that by going through the past and going through these situations that we're going to be able to be objective, which first of all, as I said, we're not, because we have a negativity bias. Everything is filtered through our negativity. We see things that don't happen. We misreport things. It's more likely, if you have social anxiety, that you're going to remember things in a more negative way than someone who doesn't have social anxiety. And even the people that you're interacting with, you are going to have a more negative representation of yourself than they will. This is backed up by the research. This isn't just me saying this to make you feel better. You have to acknowledge how negative you are. And so what this means is the treatment for this is to not go home and think about what just happened. In fact, it's not even to try to convince yourself that everything that happened was so wonderful. I put some research down in the info of the podcast. And what's interesting is that they found that CBT, which is often the model used for social anxiety, doesn't work for people who have rumination problems. You cannot think your way out of this. And what they found was what's more important is what they call your metacognitions. Your metacognition. What are metacognitions? Those are beliefs about beliefs. I've made a podcast about metacognition before. Beliefs about beliefs. And what they found was more important in overcoming your rumination. It wasn't challenging your thoughts. It wasn't changing the way you think. It was changing the way you think about the way you think. What does that mean? It means that for people who believe that rumination is valuable, for people who believe that rumination is a good thing, I need to ruminate. I need to find out why I'm so bad, why I'm so wrong. I need to fix this. The people who believe that, those are the people who suffer more. That's the belief we need to change. I know I can't just convince you. I understand you're not going to just buy into this. But we have to understand that the problem is the rumination. It isn't that you're so flawed. It isn't that there's something wrong with you. Look, do you make mistakes socially? Of course you do. I mean, who doesn't? Your problem is that you hyperfixate on them, okay? So the problem we have to address is the rumination. It isn't fixing yourself. It isn't going back in time and reviewing all the things. Now, look, I know that isn't entirely your fault. To some degree, you're not choosing that, right? These thoughts are coming to you, but you are choosing to engage in them. And this is where we get into how to deal with rumination. Because when we ruminate, rumination really means you get sucked in. You get sucked in and you recycle. You're like in the thought. You believe that this is like worthwhile, right? You ever been talking to somebody who's like really anxious about something that to you makes no sense? Like you can empathize with them, but you don't really understand why they're nervous. And so you don't really get sucked in. You're like, yeah, I see it, but it doesn't affect you. You're not worried, right? Well, that's where we kind of want to be with our own anxiety. We want to see it from afar. We want to notice the thoughts. We want to see them coming. We want to say, I understand that I'm having these thoughts about all the bad stuff that happened yesterday, but maybe, just maybe, let's consider the possibility that I have a negativity bias. I'm a little biased. I tend to think that things are worse than they are. So maybe I shouldn't go down that road. This is what it looks like. This is how you talk to yourself. I tend to think that I'm more of a loser than I actually am. Let's not go down that road. I tend to think that people are thinking all these negative things about me. So what this means is instead of engaging in the thought, which here's how CBT looks. Let's say you're worried about whether or not people are thinking about it. A CBT style of addressing this might be like, well, what are the odds that someone is actually thinking about you? I mean, don't other people have other things to do? And you might say to yourself, yeah, you're right. Other people have other lives. Nobody's thinking about me. This is a common way we try to relieve our anxiety. We say to ourselves, well, nobody cares about me. People are too self-obsessed, right? They're not thinking about little old me. And we think that this is helping. But actually, a lot of CBT often becomes reassurance, right? You're just looking for reassurance. You just want to feel better. You want the anxiety to go away. So you say to yourself, yeah, people probably aren't listening to me. But the problem with that is most of the time you don't really believe it. You still have that worry. You still have that fear of like, oh, what if they are? What if they are? And the thing is, we need to address that fear. Obviously, you need to get to a point where you don't care. And part of what you can do with that is you can say to yourself, okay, well, even if they do, even if people are sitting around thinking about me, does it have to affect my life? It only affects my life because I'm ruminating about it, because I get sucked in, because I think that it matters. But I'm going to take possibility, hey, Maybe this is just my emotions getting the best of me. Maybe I'm getting too sucked in. So again, our focus is to try to distance ourselves from the rumination. And I want to be clear, this is not avoidance. This is not distraction. In fact, I dropped another link in the information about an article that explained that avoidance doesn't work either. We're not just trying to just distract. Like, don't go home and just like watch TV, because the thoughts are still there. Like, you can't actually distract yourself away from thoughts, right? Because what actually happens is in the back of your mind, you're still thinking about it. It's just not like in the front of your mind. It's just like floating in the background. Oh my God, what if? We are actively trying to address the rumination problem. So when the thoughts come up, you notice them. You say, okay, I've been here before. I know I tend to be really negative. I'm really hard on myself. I need to show myself some compassion. And I need to realize that I am so biased towards myself, I can't see the real picture. I can't see things clearly. This is the way you want to address the rumination, so that you don't get sucked in. And so that for the next time, you're not worried the next time, oh my God, last time was so bad. Is that going to happen again? Is that going to? And sometimes we get worried about the rumination. We don't want to do something because we're worried we're going to have to think about it later. So if you can master rumination, and there are different techniques, this isn't the only way. You can look into mindfulness exercises and breathing exercises. There are other ways to handle rumination, but you have to address the rumination in and of itself. Okay. And then what happens if you're able to do this, and then you're able to challenge yourself more, work on those safety behaviors, you will start to build confidence. You'll start to get positive feedback from people. And then even if you don't get positive feedback all the time, you're able to balance that out a little bit better. You realize I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to get it right all the time. But when we struggle all the time and we feel like we don't have anyone around us, we start to believe that we have to knock it out of the park every time. The pressure is always on. I got to do really well today because I want to make friends, or I want to, let's take it slow. Let's take it slow, one thing at a time. I hope you guys found this video helpful. If you have any questions, you have any topics you guys want me to cover, you can send them to the podcast. I will look them over. I will do my research, and I will get you another podcast for that topic. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep finding relevant topics that I think are interesting to me and that would be important for you guys to hear. All right. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will see you soon.